So I'd just like to welcome you all to the university and make three very, very brief announcements. First of all, the microphones in front of you will become live the moment you press the button. So I'll ask you not to press the button until question and answer, and then feel free. Could you please turn off your cell phones? There are books outside authored by the participants this evening, each of whom will be introduced by Jane. And we have complimentary copies of Forward magazine, the latest issue, at the door. Jane.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. Make sure you can hear me. First, I want to really extend my appreciation to the Taub Center, to Ron, and to everyone here, to Shane, all who worked so hard to make this event happen. We are very appreciative of the flexibility that we've had to exhibit in the last couple of days as we ran into a terrible problem with Yarom Hazoni and a lost passport and other issues. There's still the outside chance that he might show up tonight, but we're not counting on that, and I'm very, very grateful to our panelists for stepping up. And let me introduce you to them. To your right is Chloe Valdary. Chloe is an American writer and a political activist. She previously served as the Robert Bartley Fellow and Tikva Fellow under journalist and political commentator Bret Stephens, and right now she serves as Director of Partnership and Outreach for Jerusalem U, which is an Israel education organization. In the middle, perhaps not coincidentally, is Peter Beinart. He is a senior columnist at The Forward, and I've had the pleasure of working with him and editing him now for a couple of years, and it really is a pleasure. He is also an associate professor of journalism and political science at the University of New York, a contributor to The Atlantic, a political commentator on CNN. I am not really sure when he sleeps, but it is a pleasure to have him. And finally, Avi Shilon, who is an historian holding a PhD in political science and an MA in Jewish history. Avi works here. His main research interests are modern Jewish and Israeli history, with a particular focus on the Zionist right wing and Israeli politics. He is a fellow here at NYU and also writes op-eds for Haaretz. So, as you can see, we have a really terrific group of people. We're going to talk tonight about nationalism, and particularly nationalism as it relates to Zionism, through an American and Israeli lens. We may delve into Europe a little bit, since it was in the title, but frankly, I suspect that we're going to focus mostly on the United States and Israel, given the expertise of our panelists. We'll talk here until around 8 o'clock, and then we'll open the floor to your questions. So I'd like to begin with just a real basic question, because nationalism and populism are rising in the United States, in Europe, in Israel, and I think that one of the challenges facing all of us as citizens of the world right now is trying to figure out, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Who would like to start?
I will take the challenge. So first of all, I think that we should acknowledge...
Can we maybe get the mic closer to you? Avi, thank you so much.
Thank you. So first of all, I think that we should acknowledge or remember that nationalism as a phenomenon in its inception was a very good phenomenon. It comes hand in hand with egalitarian's view, with civil rights, with democracy. It was a rebellion against tyranny. So obviously it also carried the seeds of racism in it, but generally speaking, nationalism in its inception in the 18th century was about secularism, about liberalism, about freedom, about civil rights. So I wouldn't see nationalism as a phenomenon as a bad thing.
Do you agree, Peter?
I think it depends on what kinds of nationalism. It depends on how you define the nation. If you define the nation as something which is constructed based on a set of ideals, or even a common culture that is permeable enough, that is flexible enough that it can be inhabited by people whose skin color is different, whose religion is different, whose first language is different, who come from different parts of the world, then yes, I think nationalism can be a very powerful unifying force. And indeed, as Avi was saying, people who are historically have been oppressed, like African Americans in the 1960s and the rhetoric of Martin Luther King, can appeal to a certain vision of American nationalism to say, look at the words in our Declaration of Independence. We're not living up to the kind of nationalism that I'm espousing. On the other hand, I think the nationalism that we see on the march generally today is a nationalism which draws a much tighter and narrower frame around who can be in the nation and who can't. It's not always explicit, but oftentimes it's built around a notion of an ethnic or religious or even racial heritage that essentially is excluding people who, excluding immigrants, and in some cases even excluding people who have long been in the country. And so I think in many ways, there is a struggle. Steve Bannon would like you to think that there is only a struggle between nationalists and globalists. There is that struggle. There are certainly people who believe that countries should surrender more and less of their sovereignty. But there's also, and I think at least as importantly, a struggle between different visions of nationalism. Barack Obama's vision of American nationalism, I would say, is different than Donald Trump's vision of American nationalism, but to call Barack Obama a globalist, I think totally misunderstands what he was trying to say about America.
Chloe.
Well, this is so this is so far going to be a very boring panel because it seems that we all agree. So I think the issue is nationalism in excess, or certain types of impulses that might turn nationalism into its more jingoistic forms. But I think, as was pointed out already, nationalism in its initial conception was not a bad thing. You look at, for example, the Westphalian system of nationalism that was created in 1648 after the 30 Years' War, when European countries got together for the purpose of trying to create a peaceful international order, and they believed that in order to do so, you had to believe in the sanctity of national sovereignty, so that it was nationalism that would actually lead to international peace and cooperation between the nations, essentially. But what we are seeing now, as Peter pointed out, is a different type of nationalism, which says the nation above all else, the nation to the exclusion of other people for whatever arbitrary reason people want to determine, above everything else. And that is really dangerous because for obvious reasons, it's prejudicial, it's immoral, and I think that's what we're really seeing the rise of today.
So let's hold that thought for a moment and dig a little bit deeper. Would your answer be different if you were talking specifically about Jewish nationalism?
Which part of my answer?
The answer that nationalism can be a force for good.
No, my answer wouldn't be different. I think that Zionism, when we talk about Jewish nationalism, we mean Zionism. I think that Zionism serves a very specific purpose that has perhaps three prongs. Number one, the Jews as a people have historically been oppressed and persecuted in diaspora and when they've been in exile, and I think that there's a good argument to make that Israel provides a place of safety and a safe haven. but I also think that Jews as a nation are deserving of self-determination. And in addition to this idea that it's a safe place, I think there's this idea that different nations have things to say and different nations have things to contribute to the rest of the world. And I think that Israel, in many cases, has been and can be the place from which Jews as a nation contribute to the rest of the world. And I think that that in and of itself is a value, despite the fact that I think, as we've seen recently, there may be excesses of that, of the jingoistic type of nationalism being expressed in Israeli society today. But I don't think that makes Zionism in and of itself a bad thing.
Avi, are there excesses and jingoism in Israeli society, and why, and how important are they? How much do they define what Jewish nationalism is today?
I think we should think about Israel in 3 circles. One is the Israel as part of worldwide phenomenon. Secondly, Israel in the Middle East, which means Israel part of the Middle East, and because of that, and maybe I will expand on it later on, because of that we should understand Israel not only in comparison to the liberal world, but in comparison to the region in which Israel is existing. And the third circle is about development within the Israeli society. And it affected each other. So if you want to say that Israel is going into a bad process of radicalization and abandoning some of its liberal values, we should understand that it is part of what's going on in the world. But if you want to look deep into the Israeli society, you could see a lot of impressive and good phenomena. I think, for example, if you look at the attitude toward the LGBT, Israel is one of the most progress states in the world. I think in certain aspects, even with respect to the Arab Israelis, you can see much more progress nowadays. For example, until the 80s, there was no independent Arab party in the Knesset. And it wasn't so long ago, I'm speaking about the 80s. And now it's totally different. You have the Arab party is the third party in the Knesset. So there are good phenomena that happening in Israel, and there are bad phenomena which in many cases relate to what's going on in the world and not specifically about Israel.
So Peter, I think it's fair to say you had a recent experience with perhaps not such a good phenomenon, being detained when you were trying to go to a family simcha in Israel. Can you just tell everyone, in case they don't know, what that was like and what that experience of nationalism felt like?
It showed me a number of things, one of which is the it reminded me again of the extraordinary power of iPads over 10 and 12-year-olds, because when I got put in this room, it was not scary, really. It wasn't scary, but I thought we just had all this extra time that I didn't think we would have. So we were just kind of sitting there waiting around, my wife and my kids. So I said to my son, this will be a great time to work on your Devar Torah for your upcoming mitzvah. My wife, who's much wiser than me, actually said, no, this would be a great time for them to go on their iPads, because no matter what happens from now on, they will be completely oblivious. That's, in fact, right. It was quite stunning for me. I mean, they actually literally could have taken me to the gulag. The only thing my kids were concerned about was the quality of the Wi-Fi in this little room off of Ben Gurion. I mean, the truth is that if my experience says anything about the question of nationalism, it's more in terms of the reaction, which is to say that what happened to me was very, very mild. I was there for an hour, and a guy talked to me for a little while. No one went through my cell phone. No one went through my computer. Nobody. I was admitted into the country very easily. It was but it got attention, I think, because it had and I just actually wrote about this in a column that just came out for the Forward. It had a kind of a man bites dog quality, because you don't expect that nice Jewish boys are going to have trouble. Whether I'm nice or not is maybe another question. But, American Jews will have trouble getting through Ben Gurion Airport, right? On the other hand, the case of Lara Aksalam, which is going on right now, right, who's been held up for a week and actually may not get admitted at all, despite having a visa to go study at Hebrew University, that hasn't made the New York Times. And I think because it's not considered a man bites dog story, it's considered a dog bites man story, which is to say, whether they entirely recognize it or not, people kind of expect that Palestinian or Arab Americans are going to get hassled at Ben Gurion Airport, because they don't expect that Israel is going to treat Jews and non-Jews at the airport in the same way. I often find that the conversations I have at Ben Gurion as I'm coming through with the American are often what makes them so bizarre is they often strike me as just basically coded conversations about whether I'm Jewish or not. So I remember a couple times ago, the woman said to me, what's the most recent Jewish holiday? This is the El Al person, and I said, Tu B'Shvat. And she said, no, that's wrong. At another point, she said to me, and Itai will appreciate this, she said, do you go to a synagogue? And I said, yes. And she said, well, who's the rabbi? And I said, well, we don't really have a rabbi. It's a partnership minyan, so it's kind of lay-led. But anyway, it was a complete dialogue of the deaf, because essentially you're trying to have a conversation essentially to establish whether you're Jewish, sometimes with people whose own interactions with Judaism may be rather minimal. I think that the issue with Zionism and Jewish nationalism, the kind of nationalism that we see in Israel, is that it's been very successful for Jews. I mean, this is clearly one of the reasons, although not the only reason, that Jews are safer in the world today than they were 100 years ago. And it's also so political Zionism as a security project has been pretty successful. Cultural Zionism as an expression, as a project of Jewish self-expression, has also been extraordinarily successful, right? The revival of Hebrew, all kinds of fascinating cultural, even religious things, right? But if one thinks about the different kinds of nationalism that exist in different countries, in terms of how flexible they are, Zionism is not very flexible if you're not Jewish, right? It's not necessarily easy to be an American nationalist if you are not a white Christian, right? But it's easier than it is to be a Zionist if you're a Palestinian, right? Or, for that matter, if you're a Thai guest worker or a Filipina guest worker, right? Zionism is built around being Jewish, right? And it's not easy to become Jewish, right? And it's, for most people, it's an inherited characteristic. So in this way, I think the relationship with Zion, while there's a lot about Zionism which I appreciate and value, the tension between Zionism and liberal democracy, I think, is greater than the tension between American nationalism and liberal democracy. Here's one simple way to explain. Any kid who's born in the United States who's a citizen, their parents might be able to say to them, you know what, you could grow up to be president of the United States. Right? Certainly, after Barack Obama, you could imagine that conversation. Very difficult to imagine a Palestinian citizen of Israel, right, inside the Green Line, Arab Israeli, telling their kid, you're going to grow up to be the prime minister of this country, right? Because it's a country based on Jewish nationalism, and this kid is not a Jew, right? And that seems to me, that tension is a tension that I think is silly to deny, and I think all the interesting questions come after one acknowledges the tension, and then thinks about how do you try to minimize the tension, and different people will have different notions of what tension, if any tension, they're willing to accept.
Do you deny the tension, Avi?
Well, I don't want to defend Zionism, and I have many criticism toward Zionism, but when Peter was speaking, I was thinking that, Zionism is mainly for the Jews, but there are so many kind of Jews that in a way Zionism is also a cosmopolitan phenomenon, because think about it. You have Ethiopian Jews, you have Middle Eastern Jews, you have European Jews, and all of them are accepted. So if, for example, in Israel, you couldn't find a discrimination by the law against Ethiopian Jews, even though they are black. And you could find it in many other national states, especially in the United States. So yes, it's for the Jews, yeah, but because the Jews are spread all over the world and you have so many kind of Jews, you can see it also as a very acceptable nationalism.
But where do the Palestinians fit into that?
This is the problem. Okay, this is the problem, but it's important to think about the Jewish people not as a monolithic people, because then you can see some of the beauty of Zionism, the readiness to accept each and everyone into the community. Now you're asking me about the Palestinians. Yeah, here we have a major problem, and this is something that we should think about in order to, let me phrase it in another way. In order to make Zionism a good phenomenon for the Palestinians as well, you should respect some of the Zionist values. I think, you know, if we are taking this conversation to a much more moderate level, in a personal level, if you want to convince me, you need to treat me with respect. You need to engage with me. And I think that one of the problems is that Zionism is being treated by the Palestinians, by many in the liberal world, in a very bad attitude. And if we would try to, you know, to embrace some of the Zionist values, we could utilize it also in order to adjust Zionism toward the Palestinians as well.
So, Chloe, do liberals have a problem with Zionism? And how do you reconcile that? How do you see it, and how do you think it ought to go instead?
So this is a great question. I wouldn't say, I don't want to generalize and say all liberals have a problem with Zionism. I think increasingly on the left, there have been more and more criticisms of Zionism, certainly. I think that one of the ways the left, I'll say the left instead of liberals, but one of the ways the left, I think, can learn more about Zionism is by engaging with that fact that Avi just pointed out about Israeli society, which is to say that, yes, Zionism is about Jewish sovereignty, but even within Judaism is very multifaceted, and there are Jews from all over the world, and so it is actually fascinating to think about, for example, the way identity plays a role in Israeli society, and it plays a role in such a way that's actually different than here in America, and in a way that we can often learn from. So, for example, if you were to look at how Mizrahi music, for example, went from counterculture to mainstream culture in the 70s in Israeli society, or if you were to look at some of the campaigns that Israel as a country took to bring over Yemenite Jews and bring over Ethiopian Jews in different eras in its history, I think that there's actually a lot that the left and liberals can learn about how that contributes to the creation of a people and loyalty to a people. And I think that yes, the Palestinian issue is a real issue that has to be grappled over and reconciled with, but there are still other lessons to take in from that chapter of Zionism, and I think that that's too dismissed or swept away, because everything we talk about these days when it comes to Zionism is about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. When if we could talk about those other aspects of Zionism, perhaps we could actually get closer to solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So that's one thing I would say the left can learn from, especially because the left is very much interested in this question of multiculturalism, and the left is very much interested in this question of diversity and cultivating diversity in society. And Zionism has done that to a large extent. Again, even though it's a Jewish society, there's so much diversity within that, and there's so much that is required to make that work. Another interesting thing, this is sort of a side note, but And I know we're going to get to the nation state bill later, but this is fascinating because I think about the Druze community and the place of the Druze within Israel, because we talk about, a Palestinian may not be able to tell right now, I hope that changes, but a Palestinian might not be able to tell his son that he will one day be prime minister. But I actually think a Druze could tell his son that he may one day be prime minister in Israel. And I think there's a fascinating question about the Druze, because the Jews, for those of you who are not familiar, the Jews are not Jewish, but as a matter of their religious identity, they feel a sense of obligation to the Jewish people. They feel that they need to serve in the IDF at great rates. And I think that there's something interesting that we as Americans can learn, and certainly the left can learn from that, about obligation to one's fellow citizen. We call ourselves the United States of America, but then there's this interesting question about what does it actually mean to be united and have a sense of duty to each other. And so I think that there are interesting things happening within Israeli society, including what's happening with the Druze-Jewish relationship that we, and certainly the left, could learn from.
So Peter, we've heard from both Avi and Chloe about the salutary effects of the diversity within Zionism. Does that help to assuage your concerns?
No, I think that not that I don't agree with a lot of what was said. I mean, I do think that, look, creating an identity, an identity that can deal with the religious and geographical and cultural divisions among Jews itself is difficult enough, right? I remember very distinctly being in Israel in the late 1990s at a particular moment of kind of height of optimism, just after Barak had been elected, height of optimism about the two-state solution, and having kind of secular, Chinoni Israeli, kind of liberal Israeli say to me, was so looking forward to when we can get rid of this pesky Israeli-Palestinian problem so we can get onto the real fight, which is destroying the Haredim. Destroying the ultra-Orthodox. Let's get to the real fight. Let's get this kind of first, this this warm-up act over. Like let's get to the real blood struggle. In a way, I mean, part of what they were getting at, I think, is interesting, is that in a certain kind of way, the existence of an external enemy probably serves to keep a certain kind of lid on the tensions within Jewish society. I think that to some degree that happened in the United States too. I don't think it's a coincidence that the United States impeached Bill Clinton after the end of the Cold War. When the US lost the kind of existential kind of 50-year struggle against the Soviet Union, which had been preceded by World War II, I think that's what made the 1990s so combustible as an era of internal discord about what the nature of American identity was, because it was a period of relatively low foreign threats. But no matter what Zionism's successes, and I think they're very real and considerable in terms of unifying disparate groups of Jews, you still have the fact that 20% of Israel's citizens and 50% of the people under Israeli control, if you include Gaza, which I would, are not Jews in a Jewish state. And so that creates real questions, right, about if liberal democracy, and even if you read the words of Israel's Declaration of Independence, complete equality of social and political rights irrespective of race, religion, and sex, right? The idea of liberal democracy is that everyone is equal in the eyes of the law, and Israeli there's a tension between a state which promises complete equality and a state which says we have a special obligation to protect and represent people of a particular ethno-religious group. And that plays itself out in many, 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 many ways in Israel. Symbolic ways like the flag or the national anthem, questions of immigration policy. Israel has there are many countries that have some kind of preference for people of a particular ethnic group, but Israel has a very extreme version of that, in the sense that Jews get citizenship on day one, and it's extremely difficult to emigrate to Israel and become a citizen if you're not Jewish. So Israel has a very extreme version of an exclusionary immigration policy from a kind of liberal democratic perspective, and of course we have the tradition that is, although there are now Palestinian-Israeli parties, there has always been a de facto understanding in Israel that to have legitimacy as a governing coalition, you have to have a Jewish majority in the Knesset. You can't get to your governing majority by including Palestinian parties. So these are, these are pretty significant problems from a liberal democratic perspective. I think that these debates really come down to the question of what would be I think to me the interesting questions are, to what degree can Israeli national identity be made more inclusive? I think this is a really crucial question for Israel. It would be a crucial question after the creation of a Palestinian state. At one end, you've got people like Beinart Avishai, right, who in his book, The Hebrew Republic, said, what you do is you make Israeli national identity based around religion, about the language, about the Hebrew language, right, which many Palestinian Israelis already speak, and that's and Thai guest workers and Filipinos can come and they can embrace it, and that's a much more flexible and kind of inclusive definition. At another, you could say, well, no, we still need a state that protects Jews qua Jews, but we're willing to make certain changes, certain accommodations, in order to try to build a sense of kind of buying into the national project among people who are not Jews. We can talk about some of the different things that might be worthwhile for doing that, but I actually think that that's going to be a crucial conversation for Israelis to have.
So is that conversation helped or hindered by the new nation-state bill? Avi?
First of all, there was a huge fuss about the nation bill, but we should remember that we should distinguish between theory and reality. When you compare the nation bill to the Declaration of Independence, so of course the Declaration of Independence was much more egalitarian, yeah. But the Declaration of Independence came hand in hand with the military role on the Arab Israelis, yeah. So now we have the nation bill, but the situation of the Arab Israelis is much better. So even if, of course, I'm against this bill and I don't understand why the Israeli government needs it, unless we think about the revisionist movement, which was in most cases much more about declaration than about action. So it's some kind of unnecessary declaration of, yes, we are a Jewish state. But in reality, it doesn't matter. I think that the present condition of the Arabs, even under this law, is much better than the previous, in the previous time.
But does it depend on which Arabs you're talking about?
What do you mean?
Well, or do they live inside the Green Line or outside?
Yeah, it's a huge question. You know, I heard that from someone that Israel actually imposed military role from its inception until today, because in the beginning it was on the Arab Israelis until 66, and from 67 is on the Palestinians. So it's a huge question if you want to see Israel as someone, if you want to see Israel only until the green light, or moreover, including the territories. I prefer to see a brighter future. I think that we should not see what's going on nowadays as something that should be permanent. And I think that we should remember that only, maybe not only, but 20 years ago, it looks like we could have had a prosperous region with two states. So yes, now we are in a very problematic situation. It is not only because of Israel. It is not only because of the Israelis, even if we should take responsibility on the situation. But you know, the Middle East, since the Arab Spring has changed, it became much more harder to achieve peace in the current situation of the Middle East. But I still think that the best solution, and not only the best solution, I still think that we are going into two-state solution, and we should not think about it as something that vanished.
stick with the nation-state bill for a moment. Chloe, if you were in the Knesset, would you have voted for it?
No, because I personally have a very soft place in my heart, especially for the Jewish community. And the reason for that is complicated, and I don't want to really get into it, but I think that if you have, especially the Druze, who are a minority in Israel, who enroll in the IDF at rates actually greater than the Jewish population of Israel, who believe themselves to be a part of what they call a blood covenant with the Jewish people, and who are invested in the Jewish state as a Jewish state, and who have sacrificed blood, sweat, and tears to preserve that Jewish state, I think that I would find it very difficult to support a bill for that reason alone of that community feeling, disenfranchised because of the bill. I also I didn't agree with the demotion of Arabic. I didn't see what the purpose of that. I think that one can imagine actually a future Israeli republic, so to speak, where the non-Jewish citizens, including the Arab citizens, can buy into the idea of a Jewish state, given certain provisions that are made as a result of accommodation to that minority community. And I don't think demoting Arabic serves that purpose, or serves moving toward that future.
Thank you. So one of the things that I've thought about is how much of the issues of nationalism, Jewish nationalism, in the Israeli context, actually is controlled by who gets to be there. It's a rare situation where a definition of who is a Jew actually affects your immigration policy, and that somebody from Queens or Queensland who demonstrates that they are Jewish, to some degree has more of a chance of being a full Israeli citizen, say, than if you were Palestinian going back many generations in East Jerusalem right now. East Jerusalemites being essentially stateless. And would this concept be easier to accept if the immigration policy to Israel changed? Anybody?
I'll take a shot at it. For me, yes. I think that, as my friend Hillel Ben Sasson once put it, he said, Israel has an immigration policy that might have been decent in 1947, but I don't think it's decent in 2018. Which is to say, I do believe that in the importance of having a country in the world that is a refuge for Jews in distress, and that sees it as having a special responsibility to protect Jews who are in danger, as Chloe pointed out, Israel did, for instance, when it sent airplanes to pick up Jews in Ethiopia. But I think that to say that that means that any Jew around the world needs to be able to come and get citizenship on day one, whether they're in any distress or not, and my friend Youssef Munayar from Lod cannot bring his wife from the West Bank to live with him and become an Israeli citizen. That, to me, is, as someone who believes in equality, is a bridge too far. And I think it's so I don't know that I haven't thought this through enough to know exactly how I would write up a specific immigration policy for Israel. I don't think I could do that even for the United States. But I would shift I would move it in the direction more, I think, towards concerns about for equality for populations that are already in Israel, to try to formulate it so that Israel can take what I think is a more humane policy vis-a-vis refugees, since in a certain way I actually think that one could even think about what it means to be a Jewish state, right? Not simply a state of Jews, but a Jewish state as itself containing an obligation to take in people who are who are strangers who have been cast out of the land that they were in. That seems to me a very Jewish thing to do, given that it's mentioned 36 times in the Torah that we're supposed to remember that we were strangers in the land of Egypt and to remember the heart of the stranger. But I also think that that this would allow Israel, I think, perhaps to find ways of dealing with, I think, these really, really tragic and I think really, really unfair situations that it finds itself in, where it brings in people come to work in Israel from Thailand or the Philippines or wherever, have children in Israel, have children who are, Hebrew speaking, deeply Israeli in many senses, but basically have no future in the country. To me, I think that a better immigration policy would be one that shifted the balance, I think, more towards some of these universalistic values, while not surrendering the idea that at the end of the day, Israel still has to be the place that Jews who are in danger in the world can always go.
I think it is no wonder that Peter is speaking about thinking about a better policy. Because in the end of the day, if you want to have a Jewish state, you must give the Jews a preference. You have no other choice. Otherwise, you should start speaking about a totally different state. And we should be brave enough and to speak about it with clarity and to acknowledge it. I think the main problem is with respect to not only Jewish values, but also Jewish spirituality. I think what is lacking in the Jewish state today is some kind of spiritual wave. And when I'm talking about a spiritual way of thinking, I even think about seeing the Palestinian as part of the Jewish story. Because nowadays, they obviously represent the Jews in other periods in time. So trying to think about, not only to be afraid from the amalgamation of religion and nationalism, but to use religious values, to use spiritual values in order to quell the racism that is inherited in a way in Judaism.
Does that resonate with you, Chloe?
So I sort of didn't understand the last part of that.
What part? With respect to the religion?
So I agree that I think that the Jewishness of the state itself should inform the values, the way the state carries itself. And that you could argue that it is precisely a Jewish state that should have a more liberal immigration plan and a more liberal immigration program, because this is what it means to be a Jewish state, essentially. And so you could balance both of those two things out. You could balance telling every Jew who wants to make Aliyah that you can automatically make Aliyah, but you can also develop a plan within that says to the children of Thai immigrants that you also have a path to citizenship in this country. So I definitely agree with that. I don't think I understood the last statement you made about values quelling the inherent racism within Judaism, unless I misheard you.
I meant to say something like, seeing the Palestinians, I don't want to go further to Judith Butler, yeah? But seeing, Judaism not only as something that belonged to Jews by ethnicity, but Judaism as an idea. And if you look at Judaism as an idea, yeah, then you can include the Palestinians in this period within your idea, within your identity. It's a bit complicated, but this is the progress that we should make.
I think I understand what you're saying. Okay, I understand more. I think it's sort of this I think speaks to a little bit about what Ahad Ha'am got to, right? In addition to political Judaism, you also have cultural Judaism, and what are going to be the products of that cultural Judaism, and how is it going to view the other, essentially? And I think that there have been a lot of people trying to work on this, specifically to the Palestinian issue. There are organizations within the West Bank that are trying to bring more Jews and Palestinians together. There's Yossi Klein Halevi, who just had a book out called Letter to My Palestinian Neighbor. Maybe it's just because I'm noticing it, but it seems to me that there's more and more talk about exactly that right now happening. There's just a piece in the Times of Israel by Shai Held about how the left and the right in Israel have misunderstood, like the left has been trying to totally end the conflict, the right has been trying to manage the conflict, and he argues that even if you don't think you can totally end the conflict, there are certain steps you can take at the very least to shrink the conflict. And this includes taking steps to, for example, make social mobility for Palestinians easier, and taking other steps, whether it's investing in Gaza, trying to build more infrastructure in Gaza so that there's an actual economy in Gaza. So I think that Judaism and Jewish culture is flexible enough and open enough to be able to contain those ideas and to advance them forward within Israeli society.
Thank you. So in a few minutes, we're going to open the floor to your questions. But before we do that, I'd like to just shift the focus a little bit back to the United States and President Trump. When he was here in New York last month addressing the United Nations, he talked about his idea of America first. And he also told other nations that they should sort of think of themselves first, too. How do you define Trumpian nationalism in the context of what we've been talking about here? And is that a good thing? And if not, what are the dangers?
The notion that Donald Trump is telling the other countries that America has complete sovereignty, but don't worry, you have complete sovereignty too. You leave us alone, we leave you alone, is absurd, right? I mean, it's absurd. Donald Trump is insisting on a heightened degree of sovereignty in the United States, but he's not interested in respecting the sovereignty of other countries actually much at all. I mean, the United States is dropping sending drone strikes in, actually under Trump they're expanding. Now we're going to be doing drone strikes in Niger and Mali as well, in addition to in South Asia and parts of the Middle East. His administration was talking with some generals about potentially a coup in Venezuela. He's actually lifted the rules about U.S. military operations. So this is, I think, rhetorically maybe he says this, but in truth I would say it's a kind of different kind of imperial management. Donald Trump is not giving up on the idea of America as a kind of empire, but it's a different, he's doing it in a different way, which is to say previous presidents, I think, were interested in legitimizing America's kind of hegemonic, or whatever you want to call it, kind of role in the world in various ways through certain kind of reciprocal obligations, and through various institutions that would, that even though they were very imbalanced, did create at least a veneer of obligations to the United States, whereas Donald Trump is a much harsher kind of return to a kind of unvarnished kind of imperialism, more like a kind of, you saw in the campaign where he basically said, if we were going to Iraq, why didn't we just take all the oil, right? It's kind of more of a kind of cruder kind of 19th century, I would say, version of nationalism. I think also Trump's vision of who gets to be in the American nation is different. You can see it in all kinds of different coded ways in which he talks. But basically, the idea is that true Americanism, right, are basically the true Americans are the people who were on top in the 1950s, the people who are here and on top in the 1950s, and everybody else is in some ways a kind of a threat to that pure American nation that we kind of romanticize, because they're diluting it in various ways, they're trying to undermine it, overthrow it in various ways, and so you see the people around this, right? Like so, and again, in playing, it's not vocalized as we were on top, we need to stay on top, and other people need to stay out or stay on bottom. It's vocalized as we are now the victims. Right? We are the oppressed group, we straight Christian white Americans, we are the victims, and we need to overcome our oppression, right? Which is, I think, the way that kind of nationalist bigots have often spoken about their situation, right? That they're kind of, imagine in the 19th century, in Europe, the Jews are really running everything. We need to take back the country from the Jews, right? So you get that, you can see these kind of, like you saw it during the Kavanaugh hearings. But I'm reminded, by the way, of the Kavanaugh hearings by the setup of this room. I feel like in some ways we're, like you're the senators. And, but so Lindsey Graham says, something like, as a white male from South Carolina, I guess I'm not allowed to say anything, but I'm going to say anything anyway. Like, did I miss something? Are white males from South Carolina not allowed to speak in the United States? Are they an oppressed class, right? But if you watch, but the entire thrust of the discourse from Trump and his allies in Fox is precisely to give you that message, and I think we saw one of the results of it in the result of the Kavanaugh hearings. Because it's not surprising that since Republicans tell pollsters that there's more discrimination against men in the United States than there is against women, that they would be more inclined to see the Kavanaugh hearings as a narrative of the further oppression of men, rather than actually, an effort by women to gain legitimate inquiry into accusations of sexual assault. So that's my view of Trumpian nationalism.
I think that Donald Trump obviously is not a smart person, but he knows how to touch upon very deep emotional feelings. And one of the most popular words in the liberal vocabulary is diversity, yes? But actually, because of globalization, we are losing the diversity and everything is almost the same in the world. So when Trump says each state for itself, it touches upon very important feeling that everyone still wants to keep its own identity. And this is why what he says was very important for many states, I think.
Did you hear it that way, Chloe?
This is interesting.
Thanks.
So I agree with what Peter just said. I don't think it's the full story, though, because we have two parties in this country. And it's interesting you brought up the this weird thing happening where senators who are straight white males saying, I guess I can't speak because I'm a straight white male, but I'm going to speak anyway. But what's interesting about that is that there are left-wing publications saying that straight white men cannot speak. That is a fact, and that is happening more and more in certain circles in the left. I don't know if you guys recently saw what was happening in Portland this week, but there was a video that surfaced where basically members of a group protesting and something that happened took over a street in Portland, and there were people trying to get home. It was around rush hour, and they were stopping people, and some people were getting mad, like, who are these people? They have no authority to direct traffic. Why are they stopping me from turning to where I want to turn? And one guy happened to be, presumably, I don't know if he was straight, but presumably straight, and a white male, and the license plate didn't say, it said North Carolina on it, and interestingly enough, a white male who was a part of this protest says to him, yeah, Whitey, that's right. You can't turn this way. You can't turn this way, Whitey. You're probably part of the KKK. That's right. So I think it is, I don't think it's good that we lie to ourselves. There is something happening on the cultural left, which doesn't excuse what's happening on the cultural right, but certainly fuels the cultural right. And when you have increasingly mainstream papers, including, let's say, I don't know if you follow these magazines, but Cosmopolitan magazine is a bit of a mainstream magazine. Everydayfeminist.com is a growing mainstream magazine. Huffington Post, these types of opinions are published all the time. Yes, telling straight white men that they cannot speak and they should not speak because they are straight white men. That is happening. It started happening in academia, in the halls of universities that promote a very intersectionalist view of society, and that is happening, and that is something that I think that the sane left has to contend with in its own ranks, and I think that we need a sane left to contend with the right which is losing its mind, and that cause is not serviced by pretending as if these things aren't happening, because they are happening. And it isn't to say that, you know, Senator Lindsey Graham isn't being overdramatic and ridiculous, but there is a kernel of truth in what he's talking about, because again, that is happening on the cultural end of society right now.
Well, thank you. I'd like to open the floor to your questions. Let's do it this way. Please just raise your hand. I do want to encourage questions, not campaign statements, if you will. There's a button on your desk by the microphone, so if I call upon you, just turn on the button so that everyone else can hear as well. Yes.
Hi. Okay, so I want to ask about some elements of our tradition that contribute to the exclusivity. So, first of all, the whole chosen people thing. The triumphalism, you know, look how many seats we have on the Supreme Court and Nobel Prizes and all of that lifting up. And the traditional way that we have, that our religion has been practiced, being used to exclude people from the public square, whether they're women or other liberal, more creative forms of practice. So, and no one touched on that, so I'm interested to hear what you have to say.
Anyone want to respond? May I ask this, do you see this as a part of the nationalistic question?
That's kind of what I'm asking. I mean, when I think about exclusivity in Judaism, those things naturally come into the mix, and we didn't hear about them, so are they not, or are they or we'll know they are so much that we don't even have to mention them?
I can reply at least with respect to the being chosen. Yes, I think that we should adopt this idea, and again, to say something like, because we are being chosen, we want to include the Palestinians with us, and not to be afraid from this notion, because it would be very difficult to erase it after such a long Jewish history.
So I think that there's so many different parts to your question. I mean, certainly, even though Israel has managed to incorporate a lot of different people from different backgrounds into kind of Jewish Israel, it's also clearly, when it comes to, for instance, you know, forms of Jewish expression, doesn't treat them all equally, I think that Israel would be a much healthier society in many ways, including religiously, if it didn't have a chief rabbinate and didn't have an official role for Orthodox rabbis, and tried to have a kind of an equal kind of hands-off approach to all forms of kind of Jewish spirituality and religious expression. I also think, that you know, part of what I think Jews have not sufficiently wrestled with is that there's a lot of our own tradition has a lot of hatred of the other in it. It has some nice parts too about our obligations to the other, but also has a lot of hatred of the other. And I think that since some of that, you know, you might have excused, given that it came out of a certain moment in time where Jews didn't really have any power to do anything about it, right? You know, you think about some of the prayers kind of written during the Crusades, you know, it's just kind of like the Jews are basically kind of muttering to themselves, how are we going to get back at these Crusaders? Oh, I know, we'll add this line into Aleinu, you know, it's like, that'll really get back at them, you know? But I think that once you have power, and once you have a state and you actually have non-Jews living under your control, I think then you are obligated to take those aspects of your tradition more seriously and grapple with them, right? And not hold on to the idea that you are permanent victims or somehow you are infallible and incapable. And I think that my experience is obviously much more in the United States than in Israel, but I can just say in the United States, in the Jewish communities that I've been part of, in the Jewish, there's, I think, a general tendency to ignore and gloss over the parts of Jewish texts or Jewish liturgy which which involve hatred and the abuse of power. So that, you know, the story of Purim is very often kind of told as a story that kind of ends with the saving of the Jewish people, right, in Persia. Not often, and I think Yoram Hazony, to his credit, actually has given a fair amount of thought to trying to defend what happens at the end of Megillas Esther, but I find generally, in my experience in the United States, it's just not talked about at all. Or you can read, you can read someone like Jonathan Sacks, for instance, very, very influential, maybe the most influential Orthodox rabbi in the English-speaking world today, writes beautifully about all kinds of things. And I have read Jonathan Sacks. I have read so much Jonathan Sacks, and I have benefited enormously from all. But I have been struck that in all of the reading of Jonathan Sacks that I have read, I have almost never seen him address things like the parts of Navi where Jews basically are told to go and exterminate the indigenous peoples of, or the peoples who, the nations that exist in Canaan, right? And I think there's a tendency to just avoid that subject rather than actually try to struggle with it, and I think we would be better off if people were more willing to face it.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
A question for Avi, and it's going to be a question from the Israeli angle of this audience. You said that you still envision in the foreseen future a two-state solution. Now, given the current political situation, both in Israel and also on the Palestinian side, how can you see such a solution as still viable?
You mean because of the settlers?
I mean, due to the current pervading political situation, both in Israel, and I mean the entire Israeli establishment, government, etc., and also due to the division on the Palestinian side between Fatah West Bank and Hamas Gaza and so forth.
Yeah, I didn't mean to speak about the two-state solution as something that should happen immediately or in 1 year or 2 years. I meant to speak about the popular trend to claim that there would be no such solution of two states. And I think that most of the people who are claiming that we cannot achieve any more two states, they are stressing their view because of the settlements. We have too much settlements now. We cannot dismantle the settlements. And I think that when we're going to have peace, and when we think about peace, the settlers should not be a problem, because we are going to have peace. So if we are really going to have peace between the people, and when I'm speaking about two-state solution, I'm speaking about some kind of confederation, which, by the way, was the vision of Ben-Gurion, and in a way also of Jabotinsky. And in this case, I still think that the two-states solution could materialize into reality.
Thank you. Another question. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, so this question touches upon a point that Peter brought up, but I'd be interested in what anybody in the panel has to say about it. So Peter mentioned that the children of work immigrants in Israel, their lack of legitimate status means that in the end they have no future. But I'm interested to know what you think if if the state doesn't have coherent, holistic policies to counter or to help these children, what will the future be for the state of Israel? Not for these children, but for Israel politically, economically, socially.
I mean, Israel can deport people, right? Which it does. Israel, that's one option. Israel can keep people in Israel, but basically give them no path to being citizens of the country in which they live. I don't think Israel needs to have an open immigration policy to anyone who wants to come, but I think that I'm generally not a fan, both either in the United States or in Israel, of basically of programs that treat people who come to your country as workers, but not as full human beings. And that's why, for instance, I would be vehemently against any immigration reform in the United States that basically allowed people in the United States who were here, who would come as undocumented people, to stay and as normalized people, but not as people who have a path to citizenship. Since it seems to me then you're creating a kind of a caste, a different kind of legal caste system, even inside the Green Line, as opposed to what you have in the West Bank. Now, I think the natural response to any of this would be, well, but don't you imperil the Israel's Jewish majority if you let children of Thai workers stay and become Israeli citizens even though they're not Jewish, or you let in Sudanese refugees, or you let in Palestinians whose family members are inside the Green Line. It's interesting in a way that Israel actually did, with the Soviet exodus, allow a lot of people who actually were not Jewish by a certain definition, right? And it seemed to manage that. But I'll put my cards on the table. A Jewish majority in the state of Israel is something that I am happy about, something that I would like to see be maintained, but not at any cost. So to me, there are things that I would be willing to do to try to maintain a Jewish majority, but to me, it's not the trump card that basically allows Israel to do whatever it takes, no matter how much that violates universalistic values that I believe in.
Anybody else want to chime in there? No, thank you. Yes, Ron.
I'd like to thank the speakers for their candor in raising so many sensitive subjects. I think a large part of the discussion, as it relates to the law of return, has been based on a misconception. The law doesn't allow just Jews to come to Israel. The law, as it was revised in 1972, says that anyone with a Jewish grandparent can come to Israel, which makes Israel very similar to a whole list of countries, including countries like Ireland and Germany, who constitutionally give preference to people who have legacy traditions an affinity to the existing community. So my question to you, in what way is Israel any different from these countries?
Right. So, yes, you're absolutely right that the definition of Jewishness for the purpose of immigration is not a halachic definition of Jewishness, right? It's more open than that. You could say it's Hitler's definition or whatever you want to say, but it's a more open definition of that. But I think what makes it, and I'm not an expert on Irish immigration law, right? But what I think makes Israel different is that is how extraordinarily difficult. It's not the fact that Israel gives a preference. It's the fact that if you do not fall within this category, if you don't have one of your four grandparents being Jewish, then gaining citizenship is extraordinarily difficult. I would imagine that I could go to Ireland and eventually, over time, become an Irish citizen, right? Despite the fact that I don't have any legacy preferences in Ireland. So it seems to me Israel is a much more extreme version of this than you find in other countries, especially when you think about the fact that it's not just Israel has a legacy preference for Jews, who I'm perfectly willing to, happy to see as people who have an ancestral connection there, right? But it has a whole other group of people, Palestinians, who have an ancestral connection there, right? And actually can't access that, right? So you've got two groups of people who I think can claim an ancestral connection, Jews and Palestinians. You allow one of them to take advantage of this, but the other one, actually, you make it extraordinarily difficult, right? Lara Aksalam, who's sitting in detention right now in Israel, her grandparents are from Haifa, right? And she has no right to come emigrate to Israel, or for that matter, even go and study at Hebrew University for a year.
Which is that for 70 years we're dealing with people around us who want to kill us. And television, it's in their day-to-day interaction. Now, I recall very well, after 1967, there was a great interest and openness among the Jewish population to be much more open and inclusive with our neighbors. And as time went on, this sort of declined. And I think that applying universal concepts to this particular area is right now unrealistic. And I have difficulties understanding, especially with Peter, that he's talking about, he's comparing essentially Israel to situations in many other countries, trying to assume that we should, even being Jewish, we should be even more liberal, more inclusive, more universal about it. The reality is, I don't think the other side is interested at all. And that's the difficulty. It's a long change. I'm hopeful, as Avi is, but I think I agree, it's going to be a very long road.
Thank you. Peter, I want to give you a chance to respond, but Avi, I do want to pick up on this question because in your opening remarks, you talked about nationalism in the Israeli context being sort of conceived of in three different ways, and it seems that that's part of what you were bringing up, basically looking at Israel and the neighborhood in which it exists. So I'm wondering if you would like to respond first.
Yeah, as I said in the beginning, I think in part, we should understand, Israel as a Middle Eastern state, and to compare it to what's happening in this region. But I totally disagree with you because I don't think that you can claim that Israel is dealing with people whom all of them want to destroy Israel, But I agree with you that we should understand Israel as a unique phenomenon with respect to the conflict. I mean, for me, if I see some Israeli who claims we need to kill all Arabs, or someone from Gaza who claims we need to kill all the Jews, for me, obviously, I'm not agreeing with them, but I can understand them because they are suffering from the conflict. And when I see Donald Trump, for example, speaking with such hatred toward the Mexicans, this is something that I totally cannot understand, not only agree because you don't really have a conflict with the Mexicans. So we should, when we think about the Israelis and when we think about Palestinians, take into consideration that we are experiencing a conflict, and it affects us.
So first of all, part of the group of people that we're talking about is these people who, hate Israel and want to destroy Israel in this construct are Israel's own Palestinian citizens, right, inside the Green Line. So it seems to me that unless your plan is to expel them, then you're, even from the kind of most hard-nosed security perspective, right? You are for Israel's own security. Israel would do very well to try to create a national identity inclusive enough so they feel included, right? Because I think that we could probably all agree that among the most dangerous scenarios that we could possibly imagine for the state of Israel would be an internal intifada, an uprising of the population of Israel that's actually already in the Green Line and has pretty much free movement throughout the Green Line, right? In terms of the kind of larger Middle East, there's no question that most people in the larger Middle East were opposed to Zionism and fought Zionism, right? I think that's pretty clear, and still oppose Zionism, right? And I think it's dangerous to move from there to the view that those people, because they oppose Zionism and fought Zionism, basically that their desire is to kill all the Jews or kill all the Jews of Israel, right? This was a political conflict, and in fact, even though I think most Palestinians and most Arabs in general remain anti-Zionist in the sense that they don't believe in the legitimacy of the creation of Israel, that notwithstanding, the PLO accepted Israel's right to exist in 1988 now, right? And the Arab League offered in 2002, all of the countries of the Arab League, and it was endorsed by the Islamic Conference, said that if Israel returned to the 1967 lines, and then with a just and agreed upon solution to the refugee question, and they later said that there could be land swaps, that they would accept Israel's right to exist. So I think, I don't mean this to say anything personally about you, but I think that sometimes in the Jewish community, we slip into what can become a kind of dehumanizing language in which we describe people simply because their view and experience of Zionism is different than ours. And I will say, frankly, that if I were a Palestinian, I think I would be an anti-Zionist too. That we then go from there to imagine that basically these people basically wake up in the morning with desiring to kill Jews. In my experience, for the vast, vast majority of Palestinians in particular, who I have ever met in my life, that's actually not the case at all.
I just want to, just a quick thing to add. To Peter's point, I think it's important to remember that there were entire countries like Egypt and Jordan who had sworn to annihilate all the Jews and throw them into the sea, and history is as it is, and now they're two of Israel's biggest allies, at least in the region. And I think that's important to keep that in mind in terms of how things can change over time. And things are changing, I think, in the region when you look at the interesting shift going on in the Sunni states. So to add to that point of consideration, and maybe this could be a future panel topic, we didn't really get to talk about the question of Palestinian nationalism. Because I think it is a relevant question to bring up when we're talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because there are two communities involved. And that is something that I think in some respects, Zionism is in tension with, certain aspects of Palestinian nationalism are indeed in tension with Zionism. And then there's the question of how do you reconcile that and how do you move forward? And what, if anything, is our assessment of Palestinian nationalism? If we're able to assess Trumpian nationalism, if we're able to assess Zionism as nationalism, then I think that it would be worth also asking the question about Palestinian nationalism.
That's great. I think we have an idea for another panel. But I do want to get in a couple of other questions first. Yes, the person here in the plaid shirt.
Hi, my question is about what Peter's interrogation means in the history of Zionism. I'm not just talking about Peter, but I'm talking about the detainment and interrogation of diaspora and American Jews as they're trying to enter the Jewish state. And I bring this up as a historian who studies American Jews in Israel, and has looked at documents showing the Israeli officials from the 50s and 60s welcomed American Jewish critics of Israel, and really very much wanted them to come into the country. So this is a recent change. I also want to put this in dialogue with how Israel has treated some other non-Jewish figures, such as Viktor Orban and various figures from the right in both America and Israel and Europe who have been accused of anti-Semitism. These people end up being very welcomed by the Israeli government, while some American Jewish critics are very suspect. So my question is, are we at a time when political tribe matters more than ethnic tribe? Is Gilad Erdan, when he's preventing American Jewish critics from entering the country, is he being more nationalist than Ben-Gurion, when he was far more skeptical about non-Jews, but far more open when it came to Jewish entries and Jews entering the country?
Generally speaking, I agree with you. But I think, for example, with respect to Peter's case, with what you called interrogation, it's not only, it also because of the hyper-securitization of Israel. And again, it's something that in many airports around the world, they are copying the Israeli method of profiling. So it's not only about nationalism, it's only about hyper-securalism, securitarianism.
I feel like I'm talking a lot, so why don't we go on and then
Okay, well, thank you. I think we have
question I guess you were trying to answer is Zionism reconcilable with Palestinian citizens or Palestinians, and almost like an adjustment of attitude, which I understood like on both sides. Like how can you change attitudes to make it all sort of fit together? So I just wrote down how and what. Just, you know, I mean, conceptually, it sounds good, but like just give, I mean, in your mind, like what are we talking about? Like how, given the hardened positions in 70 years history and 50 years occupation, what exactly were you thinking about?
So it's very tough thing to answer about. I think that, for example, you know, there is a clash between materialism and spiritualism, and obviously when we think about it, we tend to think that the liberal are the spiritualists and the right-wing are the materialists. But when people are expressing even racial views, yeah, actually they are craving for some spiritual search. And I think that if we would enhance Jewish spiritualism, Jewish values, we wouldn't be afraid from the demographic gene, for example. Yeah? And if the left wing and the right wing alike will take the notion of chosenness, yeah, we are the chosen people, and wouldn't be afraid of it, but we would start to discuss what is the meaning of it, yeah, and we would enhance Jewish values, even religious values, we could utilize it in order to achieve peace. And I think I have another suggestion, if I'm started to think about, that we should integrate the radical from both sides into the peace process, because what is happening is that the peace process is being conducted between the left wing and the PLO, which is like the, you know, the liberal part of the Palestinians. But if you are going to include the Hamas, the radicals, and the settlers, you could find much more common ground between them with respect to the attachment to the land, to historical values, to religion. So let's include the radicals within the peace process, and we might be surprised.
Wow, well that feels like a very hopeful, if not utopian, to end on. I really want to thank you. You've been a wonderful audience. This is just the kind of debate that we host at Forward, literally, because Peter writes for us regularly, and I hope the others will as well. But it is what we strive for on the pages of our magazine and our website every day. So I hope that you will pick up your very free copy of the latest magazine. I hope you'll go to forward.com, sign up for our free newsletters, and hopefully subscribe and support us. I'd like to thank the Taub Center for their hospitality, for putting together such a wonderful program tonight. And please join me in thanking Chloe and Peter and Avi for such a splendid